To create a lectureship in her name, and I want to acknowledge their generosity. Peter and Vivi Dimopoulos, George and Tina Kolovos, Bob and Connie Constant, Diana Post and Terry Reichelderf, Barbara Zagaris, and others. Because of Valerie's abiding love of piano and opera, we decided that the most appropriate topic for a lecture in her name was music. And today we are very fortunate to have with us an exceptional scholar and musician, Panayotis League. I want to thank my colleagues Simos Zenios and Kathy Sanchez for working so hard to create a special event today, and Maria Elena Lambrianidis, standing in the back, our media intern, for her assistance. I'm looking forward to sharing with you in the very near future amazing news about our center, which is about to expand its reach substantially. Before Simos Zenios introduces today's speaker, I would like to invite a close friend of Valerie's, Zafiris Gourgouliatos, to share some memories of her so that you can learn more about her story. Zafiri.
Thank you, Sharon. Valerie had been here in this very room many, many times, and I'm sure she would have been thrilled if she was among us. She would have been definitely here in this series of lectures. The pictures that you'll see on the screen as I'm going to flash them, you'll see she's always around people. She's always participating in social events. She's always doing things with music, with culture, with the church, the community, with gifting, with you name it. And her family originated from Chania. Through Wisconsin, they found their way to Modesto, where it was a bunch of Cretan, and they maintained and evolved there the Cretan customs, music, and dance. And Valerie, eventually, her love of music and the quality of her musical talent brought her to Los Angeles. She studied music at UCLA, piano. She was an exceptional pianist, but somehow she did not follow the pianist career. She was always around music. Her main career was in advertisement and promotions, but for the last 20 plus years, her life was devoted to the Greek causes, Greek events, and music. She was a member of the Opera League, and she was organizing lectures, fundraisings, and things with friends. And also, she was a member of the Hellenic University Club as a secretary, but secretary was an understatement. She was the heart of the club, and she was organizing the events, bringing the people, persuading people to donate for the different causes, and then bringing people together. Again, you see most of the pictures I would have is dance and with people, happy, celebrating, fundraising events. Here is with friends of the Opera League, other events at St. Sophia, social events, parties, again, St. Sophia, and the film festival. She was participating in all these things and bringing happiness. Always interesting to discuss with her whether it was history, culture, or something that was going on around Los Angeles. She was like the heart of the city and the community. And it's very brief time to say too much about her. I don't want to take too much time, but her memory is all around us, and we hope that we do things and that she believed that were important for the community. Now we see that the sponsors have created the funds for this, have given the funds for these lectures. And let's welcome the next lecturer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Zafiri, for these moving words that capture what Valerie meant to all of us. And thank you all for joining us today. Before I introduce our speaker, a few words about the outline of today's event. Following the lecture, we will have a brief Q&A session, and after that, a small intermission. And after the intermission, Dr. League will perform a selection of traditional Greek island music, songs pertaining to the Greek-American experience, and original musical settings of Greek poetry. A reception at Royce 306 will follow. Now, it is a great joy to present today's speaker and performer, Professor Panayotis League. Dr. League is a musicologist, author, performer, and composer specializing in the traditional music, dance, and oral poetry of the Greek islands, Brazil, and Ireland, as well as the electric guitar music of the American South. He grew up in the Greek immigrant community of Tarpon Springs in Florida, where his great-grandparents immigrated from the island of Kefalonia and helped found the city's sponge diving industry. He holds the position of Professor of Musicology and Director of the Center for Music of the Americas at Florida State University. He received his PhD in ethnomusicology from Harvard University, where he served as the Milman Parry Collection Fellow and continues to work as Associate in Ethnomusicology and Folklore Studies at the Center for Hellenic Studies. His research has been published in several leading academic journals, such as Ethnomusicology, the Journal of Modern Greek Studies, and the Harvard Review of Latin America. His first monograph, Echoes of the Great Catastrophe, Resounding Anatolian Greekness in Diaspora, which focuses on the legacy of late Ottoman intercommunality in the music and dance practices of Greek refugees and their descendants, was published in 2021 by University of Michigan Press. As director of the Center for Music of the Americas, he oversees educational and artistic programming that aims at bringing together diverse communities in Tallahassee and the state as a whole through the variety of music and dance traditions that weave together the tapestry of Florida's culture. In 2018, he was awarded a Traditional Artist Fellowship from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and in 2019, he was named a Master Artist by the Florida Folklife Program for his work performing and teaching traditional Greek island music and oral poetry to youth in the immigrant community of Tarpon Springs. As a musician, Dr. League has been performing the traditional music of the Greek islands and Ireland since childhood. Today, he's one of the most in-demand musicians on the international circuits of both cultures. The title of his talk today, based on his book, is Echoes of the Great Catastrophe, Resounding Anatolian Greekness in Diaspora. Panayoti, the floor is yours.
Καλώς σας βρήκα. Καλησπέρα. Good afternoon, everyone. People always say this when they are invited to give a talk somewhere, but I really, really mean it. It's really an honor and a pleasure, a delight, and a joy to be here with you all. Thank you to every single one of you for coming. An enormous thanks to Sharon Gerstel, to Simos Zenios, to Kathy Sanchez, and to everyone, to Maria Elena. I did not catch your last name, but thank you so much to all of you for helping out to make this event possible and for doing the extremely difficult, time-consuming, requiring so much energy and passion and love work to make these kinds of programs, these events, and these initiatives happen. It's really a priceless, precious thing a gift that you're giving to everyone who loves this culture, and this international, transnational heritage of humanity. And from the bottom of my heart, I thank all of you for doing this work. As my friend and colleague Simos said, I'm going to be speaking about this book project. Well, not about the book itself, but about some of the major themes of this book that I wrote. I'm going to, because I don't want to just tell you everything that's in this book, because that would take a very long time, I'm going to focus on one particular aspect, one particular set of data points or evidence in support of my my thesis, which essentially is an argument about, broadly speaking, it's an argument about personhood in the transnational Greek context. In particular, what I argue is that Anatolian Greeks, which is the term that I prefer for the people, the Greek-identified people from Western Anatolia, current Turkey, the Anatolian Peninsula, the Republic of Turkey, who for many generations, in some cases, centuries, millennia even, lived and worked on the Aegean coast of Turkey and up to somewhere in the middle of Anatolia. So I'm talking about not people from the Black Sea region, but people from places like Ayvali, from Izmir, from Smyrni, from Cappadocia, these kinds of places. Whether or not they spoke Greek, and of course many of them didn't, people who did very self-consciously identify as Greeks, we would say in English. Most of them would have said something like Romyi, Romei, Romans, of course. Certainly not, most of them would not have called themselves Hellenes until the relatively recent past. My argument is really that these people are very distinct in their concept of who they are as Greeks, both as individuals and as a collective, because in contrast to the majority of the rest of the Greek population of the world, and particularly people living and experiencing Greekness through in the environment of the modern Greek state, post-1820, these people articulated their Greekness in very explicit relation to non-Greeks, to others, to other Ottoman, late Ottoman, especially minority populations, and the majority population, by which I mean in relation, in very active, intercommunal, and I'll explain that in a minute, relation to Armenians, to Sephardic Jews, to Muslim and other people who we might call Turks today, to Persians, to Roma people, to Levantine Christians, people of Italian, French, English, etc., descent who had been living and working in that part of the world for generations. So my argument is that this is something very distinct, because these people really lived in a reality that was quite different, an ideological, political, and social reality very different from that of the majority of the rest of the Greek-speaking and Greek-identified world. And their existence was marked by what a lot of scholars of the late Ottoman period like to call intercommunality. That means something different, quite distinct from even plurality or intercultural exchange or something like that. Perhaps one of the best contemporary manifestations of this is this word. It's a Turkish word that we find in a lot of Balkan languages, komşuluk, which means something like neighborliness. This acted out ideological stance. And of course, this is something that's very hard for us to stick our finger on in the historical record, because as we know, history is comprised of big events that stand out. We don't really have a huge amount of direct, explicit evidence about people's everyday lives and relationships, right? But we can see this in a lot of contemporary Balkan society today, and there's a lot of music. I'm burying the lead there. There's a lot of evidence of this ethos of neighborliness in artistic practices, and that's what we're going to focus on today. The historian Nikos Loumanis says that the late Ottoman society was characterized by an attitude, a way of life in which difference, whether it was confessional difference, particularly confessional difference, or ethnic difference, was normative and seen as desirable and essential. And for the smooth and productive functioning of society on the micro level in the neighborhood and on the macro level in terms of the Ottoman state. And it was an environment in which conflicts, the inevitable conflicts that arise when you have others with a capital O rubbing shoulders in everyday life, were expected, and were also expected for the most part to be negotiated. Now, this is by no means meant to whitewash or to pave over or to ignore the real conflicts that had very serious consequences in people's lives, most seriously of which the loss of life, and that's really what this talk in a large part is about. But I do think that there's a very strong argument to be made that the late Ottoman version of what it meant to be a social person and a productive member of society was predicated on this idea of being a good neighbor, of not just tolerating others who had different ideas and different ways of life, but expecting that you were going to come into conflict and figuring out ways to negotiate that conflict. And it was a system that worked, no matter how we define it, on the balance worked very, very well for quite a long time. And it's very different from the 19th century, especially European ethno-nationalist idea of personhood, of citizenship, and of what it means to be a human being. So Anatolian Greeks, these people who had been living in this part of the world for millennia, for a lot of reasons were extraordinarily good at living this type of life. Their people, however you want to define it, had been there for a very long time. Even in the Ottoman period, they arose very quickly as the natural, the fundamental in-between people, the mediators between boundaries, the crossers of boundaries, and the people who are very good at recognizing how porous different kinds of social, political, and ideological boundaries are, and really crossing back and forth between them. We have so many examples from history of Greeks who were simultaneously members of the Sultan's court and of the Habsburg court, for example. The chief dragoman, or interpreter and kind of like foreign minister of the Ottoman court, was almost always, for the last several centuries of the empire, a Greek. Because of their cultural and political position, they were multilingual, they were polyglots, they were very used to going back and forth between what we tend to think of the East and West, and very comfortable doing so. Nowhere is this more noticeable and more striking than in the realm of the arts, and particularly in music. If we look at the historical record of artistic production, especially in music in the early 20th century, we see that there's hardly a recording made in Istanbul or in Izmir in the teens and 20s that doesn't have a Greek person in the orchestra, and more often than not, they were the singers who were the ones who were very explicitly crossing those boundaries linguistically, playing for audiences in a wide range of venues, audiences that were made up of the entire gamut of the ethnic groups and the confessional groups of the Ottoman Empire. So all of this, of course, came to a fiery end after World War I, after the Second Greco-Turkish War, when the invading Greek army was very soundly defeated by Kemal Atatürk's new Turkish Republican Army, and the city of Izmir was burned, and roughly 1.5 million Greek-identified people were either killed or displaced. 1.5 million people were displaced. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that history, but broadly speaking, as many of you know, the Treaty of Lausanne in 1922 set the new political boundaries that are mostly in place today between Greece and Turkey. It sent about 1.5 million Orthodox Christians who had been residing in Turkey for a very long time to Greece, and I believe 300,000 Muslims from Greece to Turkey. Dramatically changed, I would say warped, the social and political fabric of Greece in the 1920s, and the repercussions, or the echoes, as you might say, of that profound social and psychological trauma, which was the greatest humanitarian crisis that part of the world had seen up to that point, are still being felt today. What I'm going to talk about today is the story about how one particular family, from the island of Lesvos and from the coast there to the east, near Ayvalık, has been crossing these boundaries, these very porous boundaries between different cultural constructions, different genres of music, different ideas of what it means to be a Greek, to be a Westerner, to be an Easterner, to be a European, to be an American, over the last century, and how they've been articulating an idea of personhood through their music that I think is very dependent on the legacy of that late Ottoman ideal of neighborliness and crossing these boundaries. So I think that music, material culture, and particularly musical material culture, is one of the best ways to explore this. So the island of Lesvos is one of these boundaries par excellence, we could say. Always a large island with a very large population, a very economically and politically important place, has been for a very long time, you could argue, for millennia. And as you can see from these photos from the early part of the 20th century, especially that one in the bottom right, the musical culture of Lesvos has always been a place where multiple boundaries were rubbing against each other and being crossed constantly. So we can see, moving from left to right, a fellow wearing typical European dress, playing a European violin in the European style. To his right, two other guys in European dress, one of them playing the saduri, the hammer dulcimer of Persian origin, but very widely used in that part of the world. Somebody playing the euphonium, and then to the right we have three fellows wearing Anatolian festive garb, toasting each other, wearing those big pantaloons and boots and this kind of thing. And to the upper left, we see more evidence of the brass band culture. You can see a cornet, there's a clarinet, some other brass instruments in this picture of revelers. We're going to be focusing on the life and legacy of this man, Konstantinos Nikolaou Kyriakoglou. This is a picture of him in 1919, roughly, right before he left Lesvos and came to the Boston area. He himself was not a refugee, so to speak. He did not go through the great catastrophe, which is what we call in Greek the end of that war. But a lot of his relatives and people who he worked with as musicians and just as people through his life did. And his life is really, I think the great catastrophe is a prism that refracts a lot of different aspects of his life and his musical legacy. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So I want to say just a few things to frame the music theoretically, and I think it'll be useful as we think about the different ways that these people I'm going to be talking about have crossed these various cultural boundaries. The first of these terms is a Turkish word, sadakat, which in the context of Ottoman art music, what we now call Turkish classical music, is understood as, like I say here, faithfulness to a particular genealogy of style through imitation and repetition. This is part of the apprenticeship system that in Turkish is called meşk, M-E-S with a little tail on it, K, which is this mentor and pupil relationship where usually at a young age somebody is apprenticed to a master musician. They spend years and years and years often living with them, learning their repertoire, learning their style through constant repetition. And it's an oral tradition, an oral and aural tradition, not typically using any kind of written notation. This is something that has been a primary feature of Ottoman, not just art music, but also folk music in that part of the world for centuries and centuries and centuries. Another way to think about this, which again, like I said, is this absorbing style, absorbing values, artistic, aesthetic, philosophical values through being around them and through playing with them and through making them your own as an artist, through once you have gained sufficient competence, playing with them, changing them, experimenting and figuring out if they fit, if they're if they are valid interventions that fit within your lineage, your genealogy, but also push it forward and make it your own, right? A Greek word that we can use to talk about this is mimesis, mimesis, which I'm going, after classicists Gregory Nagy and Richard Martin, I want us to think about not as imitation or as those of you who are familiar with perhaps post-colonial theory, especially talking about music and dance in the Caribbean, carnival culture. We're not talking about ritual inversion, making fun of something in order to shift the balance of power. This is something very different. It means the performative reenactment of truth values, of something that is generally agreed by the culture, that is at the very heart of what it means to be who we are. And this, of course, this comes from Aristotle and the Poetics, theorizing about the performance of ancient Greek drama, of Greek theater, in which myths literally myths were performed on stage. The thing that's so arresting, so powerful, so wonderful about the invention of theater, is not the way that we think about artistic storytelling today. It was not to surprise the audience by a plot twist or telling them a story they've never heard before. It was about telling a story that everybody knows, that is part of our shared idea of who we are, of what is true and good about what binds us together, but finding a way to make it relevant to the actual moment we're living in right now, right? That's artistic innovation in this cultural sphere. That's what mimesis really means. And I think that sadakat, that Turkish word, really is the same thing. It's just on a more personal level. So as we explore these facets of musical material culture from the late Ottoman period and the immediately post-Ottoman period, I want us to think of two other ways to consider these collections of music. And these are both from the work of the musicologist Georgina Bourne. The first is thinking about musical assemblages, which is, she calls, the combination of mediations that are characteristic of a particular cultural and historical period. So not just the individual acts, the individual interventions, the individual, here's my new way of interpreting this song or doing this dance that is my offering to the greater story, but actually thinking about all those different interactions in a chain, producing, reproducing, and producing, again, new meanings that everyone can share and debate and take part of. And the other one is relayed creativity, which is that same process, but thinking about it over time, by which an artist takes something, takes it apart, decomposes it, and recomposes it, and gives it to the collective who does that again and again and again and again. That's how style develops. That's how genres emerge, right? Nothing comes from nothing, as we say, right? I was talking about this with my daughters the other day, the chicken and egg thing, and my younger daughter, Violetta, looked at me like I was stupid, and she said, "Dad, of course the egg came first." And I was like, "Yeah, but a chicken had to lay the egg." She was like, "You ever heard of dinosaurs?" So it's a good way to think about that, I think. So we're going to be talking about, like I said, this family, the Kyriakoglou family, who are from the village of Kapi in Lesvos, which is in the northeastern corner of Lesvos. In particular, focusing on these two dapper fellows, Michalis standing and Konstantinos sitting, Kyriakoglou. Konstantinos, who's the main focus, was born in 1888. His brother Michalis a few years later. They came from a musical family. The village of Kapi historically was a pretty much 50-50 Greek-Turkish place. Pretty much everyone were bilingual. And produced a lot of musicians. It was famous for its brass band culture and its mixed culture, brass ensembles that had brass instruments, violin, saduri, the hammer dulcimer, as well as percussion. Very famed for its inhabitants' multi-instrumental skills. Most musicians were expected to learn 3 or 4 different instruments. And the brothers K here, their father clearly recognized the economic and political benefits of having very highly skilled professional musicians in their family, because he sent them as teenagers to Smyrna, to Izmir, to study music. They both lived there for several years, the entirety of their adolescence, and studied Western classical music and theory and instrumentation at a European-style conservatory, and they also studied Ottoman art music privately in that sadakat or meshk system. So the brothers eventually, like I said, they left right before the Great Catastrophe and immigrated to Lynn, Massachusetts, north of Boston. This is them and 2 of their compatriots whose names I have not been able to track down yet. This was taken in Lynn in around 1925. I was able to spend a lot of time with Konstantinos' grandson and some of his other descendants, and learned a lot of wonderful stories about them. Konstantinos worked as a barber his entire life, but when they came to Massachusetts, the band immediately started working just like they had been throughout Lesvos, the Aegean coast of Turkey, and all throughout the Balkans. We have these wonderful ledger books that the family has kept, where he notates in great detail how much they got paid for different gigs. Things like, well, we played on Sunday, May 5th, or whatever. We played at the wedding of Hassan Bey's daughter in such and such town, and he paid us 5 Grosia or something like this. But they started working right away when they got to Boston. Their repertoire, we'll examine a little bit the band's repertoire, which was very explicitly pluralistic and intercommunal and cross-cultural. They already were very well equipped to play not just at Greek and other Ottoman dances, but to play early swing and to play polkas and mazurkas and tangos and that kind of thing. And in fact, the band worked so much that Michalis, with the valve trombone on the right, after a few years in Boston, left and went back to the island because, as he said, the life of a musician in America is harder and more exhausting than the life of a farmer on Lesvos. Which tells you how much they worked. So this is just a wonderful photograph from the Sappho Society, the pan-lesbian union there in Massachusetts at their annual picnic. You can see again this evidence of East and West, so to speak, coming together in different musical instruments. The lauto on the right, we have the trombone, we have violins and all kinds of other things. So what we're going to focus on here is this marvelous collection of music, of written music, of sheet music, that Konstantinos' grandson very kindly gave me access to. Greg Kyriakoglou is his name. So Konstantinos, like I said, was an extremely talented musician. He had a wide range of experience. He was also a very, very literate musician. He was a very literate man, but also a very literate musician. This is a collection of hundreds of pages of handwritten sheet music. I don't know if you can read that very well, but this is how the book had been preserved for several decades before I got my paws on it. It's wrapped in tinfoil, as you can say, and it was wrapped around with tape. And Konstantinos' son, Nicky, who we will meet at the very end of my talk, wrote on it, "Keep for Family History," written by Konstantinos Kyriakoglou, before 1910, born 1888, Kapi Mytilini, Greece, island. Violin, music, trumpet, trombone, and bass horn. Those are all the different parts that are in here, given to me by him to continue in our history. This book had not been opened, I think, for decades until Greg took it off the shelf and gave it to me. And this is the first thing I saw. This is the title, the cover page, which says Tefteri Musikon to Konstantinou Nikolaou. So, music notebook of Constantine, son of Nicholas. It's dated September 23rd, 1906. So this, I'm guessing this is when he started compiling stuff. He would have been 18 years old. Is my math right? Yes. He would have been 18 years old, so he probably was either still in Izmir or had just come back to Mytilini and was starting to write down repertoire that he had learned. So I think this collection is a treasure trove of evidence for exactly this thesis that I laid out, that musicians in particular in the Anatolian Greek community were constantly crossing boundaries and were constantly mediating between these different cultural formations, particularly musically articulated cultural formations. We can see that in this index that I compiled. So as you can see, it's about evenly split between what I'm thinking of Greek music, which are usually songs with Greek lyrics. So I'm going to call them Greek because that's, after all, what the early recording industry used as its criterion to call something Greek or Turkish or whatever. Incidentally, we can find the same song recorded 5 or 6 different times, belonging to different genres and marketed to different populations with the same musicians and the same singers based on what language the song was in. The best example of that, my favorite example of this Anatolian Greek intercommunal ethos is the singer Rosa Eskenazi. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of her, who her Greek biographer in the 70s called her the patriarchess of Greek song. She was a Turkish-speaking Sephardic Jew from Istanbul, right, who lived most of her life in Greece, spoke beautiful Greek, recorded songs in Turkish, in Greek, obviously, in several other languages. Anyway, this collection is split pretty evenly between Greek-identified songs, Ottoman art music, what we call now Turkish classical music, and what we'll call European songs, polkas, waltzes, tangos, that kind of thing. So just a few examples of just to show you the breadth of what Konstantinos was interested in and what his band was playing. This is a song, To Paramythitis Neraidas, by Theophrastos Sakellaridis, who was a very important early 20th century light opera composer based in Athens. This is one of his most famous songs. So clearly, as you can see, even if you don't read music, and I'm going to be showing a lot of scores and things, but don't worry if you don't read music. That's not, I don't expect you to. I just want you to see the evidence here, and especially see his penmanship and his attention to detail. So there's all kinds of stuff like this in here. There are things that are clearly painstakingly meticulous copies of sheet music. Here's another very popular early 20th century Greek parlor song. This is the original published sheet music that I got from the I can't remember the watermark. Anyway, one of the music libraries in Athens. Even if you don't read music, if you just look, you can see that he clearly copied the thing on the right from exactly this thing on the left, to the point that he's imitating the font, right? Everything is identical, right? So he clearly paid great attention to detail, tremendous attention to detail. Before we get to that, but a very important point that I want to make, and that follows, that I think this is a characteristic of the collection that places Konstantinos very squarely in this realm of late Ottoman sadakat, kind of informal faithfulness by repetition, is that even though it's certain that he knew exactly who composed many of the pieces in this collection, including a lot of the Ottoman art pieces, because a lot of the pieces he includes were composed during his lifetime, he never once mentions the author, mentions the composer. And this is a feature of the Ottoman tradition, in which the composer is really not a very important figure. Composerly intent, the composer's vision, this kind of thing, that's a very foreign idea in the Ottoman musical scene. There's a stark contrast to the Western idea of composerly genius and intent. The actual piece of music, in this tradition is not really a piece that's supposed to be performed one particular way, or we don't really even care about trying to figure out what the composer meant, what they were trying to express. The important thing is that it's an intervention into a tradition that we are then invited to engage with on our own terms and make our own, but not just our own as a single individual, but our own as a member of a particular lineage of artistic and ideological activity, right? So this is a big part of my argument. So moving on to some of the Ottoman classical music, these are just some examples of how we won't dwell on this, but how he transliterated Ottoman Turkish, which as you might know is quite different from the modern spoken Turkish, how he transliterated Ottoman Turkish lyrics into Greek. Clearly he understood Turkish and could at least read Ottoman well enough that he could transliterate it. And this is just a list, just to give you a sense of how relevant he was in terms of engaging with contemporary practice. I was able to identify, these are all the pieces, the Ottoman art music, the classical pieces that I was able to identify. Remember, like I said, he never gives us the name of the composer. All he tells us is the type of musical form, the Turkish equivalents of like a sonata or prelude or something like that. And he tells us what makam, something like the key or scale that it's in. More on that in a second. I was able to identify these, and the vast majority of them are by 19th century composers. So he would have been familiar with their work, and he probably would have known who they were and when they wrote the tunes, but he was not interested in preserving that for whatever reason. So I want to take a quick look at some of the ways that he notated Ottoman classical music, because it's very important. And I'm going to borrow a term from scholarship on Byzantine Orthodox liturgical music. Many scholars talk about notational schemes and strategies as paradigmatic, meaning that unlike practice in European classical art music, the notes on the page, so to speak, the dots and squiggles and the ink, is not telling us exactly what to play, right? I'm sure that, how many of you in the audience have, even when you were a kid, like took piano lessons or violin, how many of you have played Western classical music in some capacity? Yeah, quite a few of you. I'm sure that your teachers spent a lot of time, you spent a lot of time with your teacher trying to figure out like how to play this right, how to play exactly like in tune, how to play the rhythms exactly, how to get, if you're a violinist, how to get the bowing exactly right, how to get the phrasing in the right way, right? The actual practice of music in this part of the world, in the Near East, whatever we want to call it, in the Ottoman ecumene, is quite different. Since the appearance of staff notation borrowed from Europe in the latter part of the 19th century, it's been used very loosely. Think of it more as a roadmap or as a skeleton of the melody, and the performer is expected in the moment of performance, again, according to their own lineage of style that they've inherited from their teachers, from the musicians they work with. The performer is expected to loosely follow the melody so that we can recognize it, but in the moment improvise little variations and little melodic turns, dynamic shifts, invent little variations. That's very important. It's something that we're going to explore in a minute. So this is just an example of the kind of notation that he used. So it's clearly Western staff notation. This is just a little melody in the makam rast. For those of you who don't know, makam is a word, it's an Arabo-Persian word, that we use in this music roughly in the same way that we talk about modes in the West. Not quite scales, they're a collection of pitches, a collection of notes that tend to behave in a certain way together. So you can have several different makams that have all the same notes in them, all the same pitches, but they're classified separately because maybe the melodies tend to hang out on a particular scale degree. They tend to resolve in a particular place. And so if I just saw this, if I was a performer of Turkish classical music, for example, and I saw this notated this way, I wouldn't know how to play it because some of the pitches might have to be a little bit slightly flat, like in between the notes on the piano. But he writes the word rast, which is one of the modes, kind of like the major scale in Turkish classical music, and I'm like, I know exactly how to go about taking that information and interpreting it according to my own prerogatives. So he does this a lot. Here's a great example of a şarkı, which is an Ottoman art song, like lieder in Western classical music, and he's transcribed the Ottoman lyrics, the Ottoman Turkish lyrics, in Greek characters down at the bottom. Here's another example of a prelude, a peshrev, and again, even if you don't read music, just look at this right here. It's identical to this section right there. You can just see that if you look at the images. And then the rest of it it's clearly the same song, but he takes great liberties. This right here is the canonical skeleton version. Like if you're a student of Ottoman classical music and you go to the music store to buy sheet music for a piece that your teacher wants you to work on, you would get it from here. And this would be the typical example. Here he has opted for a very performative way of notation where he's adding all these flourishes and variations in a way that really, to me, reads like a transcription of a live performance. But this is something, again, in the context of this book that he's put together for himself and for his band. I interpret this as a very playful interaction with this raw material. And the most exciting piece of evidence for this theory that I found in the book is these two. So what this means is the KNKC, Konstantinos Nicolaou Kyriakopoulou collection, book 1, page 23, and book 1, page 29. There's two books, like I said, it's a couple hundred pages in total. So this is a Usak Peshrev, which is a prelude in the makam, or the mode of Ushak. We don't need to worry about what that means. It's a very famous piece by Tamburi, what was his name? Buyuk Osman, I think was the composer's name. 19th century composer, very well known. This is one of his most famous pieces. Now what's interesting about this is clearly the same tune, and I'll just, this is the same piece. I'll sing the first couple of measures of the version on the left and then on the right. So it'd be something like this. Those are the first couple of measures on the left. On the right, they're pretty much identical. There's a slight difference in the way he's notated. The first one, there's a little triplet figure, bum, 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 yum, dum, and the second it's yum, buddy, dum. But it's clearly the same melody, right? So this blew my mind when I found this, because if you read through the entire thing, if you sing through it, you play through it, I won't do that. You see that it's so obviously the same piece of music. So obviously the same piece of music, all the same phrases, little variations, but there is only one spot where he has notated both versions so that they sound exactly the same. And it's those squares right there. But he didn't notate them exactly the same, because the one on the left is written in a different time signature, 2 beats per measure, than the one on the right, which is in 4 beats. This blew my mind, because this is not the way people copy out music if they're just intending it to be used as, a cheat sheet or as a playbook. This is very clearly somebody, and again, these are only 6 pages apart, so it's not like he forgot that he had spent hours notating this piece of music. He clearly was, I think, was having fun with his tradition, was just in his, and what's remarkable is that he was notating something from his head, perhaps composing it as he went along, with the skeleton of the piece in his mind, but playing with it in a very deliberate way, and just coming up with variations. So it's just a remarkable example, like I said, I think, of this boundary crossing mediation. I want to show you a short video of what we actually did with this. We did a concert, I gave a talk about this, and we did a concert at Yale University in December of, 2016. We played a lot of this music. We rehearsed it, we picked out tunes, and a lot of this music was stuff that was played probably for the first time, certainly in that form, with this traditional lesbian ensemble of violin, saduri, guitar, and percussion. But this is one of our favorite pieces from the collection, which is he just calls it Polonica, a Polish dance. It was actually composed by a Polish nationalist composer who was captured by the Ottomans at some point in the 18th century. But it's in many ways our favorite from the collection, because it's sitting right in between what we think of as Western European music and Ottoman music. So I'll just play a few seconds of this. Gorgeous tune. As my friend Dean, who's playing the saduri, said, he said that's like our version of the song the band on the Titanic was playing as the as the ship went down. So in the few minutes we have left here, I'll show you. I want to talk a little bit about Konstantinos' son Niki Kyriakoglou. This is a picture of him in 1975. Grew up in this musical family in Lynn, Massachusetts. Like his dad, he was a barber. Like his dad, he played tons of different instruments, but his 2 favorite were the bouzouki, as you see him there, and the piano. And like his dad, he really spent a lot of his time living in between different musically articulated cultural formations. Unlike his dad, he didn't play any Ottoman art music, but his different cultural formations were post-war Greek popular music, we call like latter-day rebetika laika, American swing and jazz and popular music, which he played on the piano, and a whole host of other musics that he encountered in his barbershop in Lynn. One of his assistants was an Italian accordion player, and there's a lot of recordings that they made together playing popular Italian songs from the 50s. So, like his dad, Nicky was obsessed, I would say, that's what the family members say about both of them, obsessed with these technological means of recording musical ideas. Unlike his dad, Nicky didn't use this late 19th century technology of writing on staff paper. But like his dad, he used the best means available to him. Nicky had a big old Westcore reel-to-reel tape recorder. And his widow, Nicky unfortunately I never met because he died several years before I moved to Boston. But his widow Dottie, who just passed away a few months ago, amazing woman. Dottie told me that every day he would come home on his lunch break, and while she was getting his lunch ready, because his barbershop was down the street, he would sit down and he would record himself playing, and then he'd stay in his study late at night making these recordings. And what's amazing to me is that Nicky recorded a lot of the same material. We have about 9 or 10 hours of these homemade recordings that he made of himself in the 50s and 60s, and then later in the early 70s. He recorded himself playing the same pieces of music in radically different ways. Just as I argue his dad did with these different notational strategies. So in just the few minutes we have left, we'll listen to one. So the first example, this is a song called Apopse Putachalasa, which was recorded, tonight that I've trashed the place, which is my translation. I believe, I'm not sure if it was the first recording, but Nikos Gounaris certainly recorded it. Uh-oh, I think we need to sign back in here. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to play this and then I'll scroll down so you can see the English translation, those of you who, it's a little hard to make out the Greek. So this is Nicky in the mid to late 1950s, himself playing bouzouki and singing, and an unnamed percussionist, possibly one of his neighbors, or one of the guys who worked at the barbershop, playing along with him. And again, we don't have time to do like this, the side by side, but if you listen to the recordings, the pop recordings from the 50s, he's clearly copying the style. He's copying this, it's a zebekiko, that aggressive, hyper-masculine, individualistic men's dance. Although in the Anatolian Greek context, as some of you may know, the zebekiko is almost always danced face-to-face. But he's clearly copying the tone and tenor, even the vocal style, this highly melismatic vocal style of these kind of proto-Skilavika artists, these kind of like, Greek nightclub musicians of the time. So we'll listen to a few seconds of that. Right? Right? This kind of thing. 7, 8, 9. I mean, it's characteristic of this genre from the 50s. It's like really misogynistic and terrible. And it's great music. So just a little while later, in my mind, the temporal equivalent of Konstantinos' spatial gap between that one transcription and the next, Nicky made another recording of this same song, playing piano by himself. And it could not be more different. It could not be more different and be the same song. He very explicitly is imitating the sanduri, the lesbian dulcimer. He'll play a short taksimi, as we say, or a little improvisation that outlines the contours of the mode before he goes into the tune. And when he goes into the tune, you'll hear and feel it is heavy. It is heavy. It's so, as we would say, and as they would say in Greek, pola vari. It's so heavy, and this word heavy, varis, in the Anatolian Greek context means not just slow and laid back and behind the beat, but full of all kinds of space that invites, especially the dancer, to interpret the sounds in their own way, tailored to their own body, to their own physical presence. And in this tradition, like this is how to express kind of tough guy masculinity, right? It's this really slow and heavy way of interpreting a song. And I contend that this is very clearly Nicky working out a way to play this contemporary pop song. And he made this first recording within weeks of the single coming out, right? I mean, he went down to the Greek Favor in Lynn, Massachusetts, and bought it and learned it note for note. This is very clearly to me him working out in real time how to turn this into a lesbian song, an Anatolian Greek song. And tellingly, this is the only audio recording that exists, as far as we know, of his dad, Konstantinos, who was an old man at that point, but we can hear him singing in unison together with Nicky on the chorus. So we'll listen to that. That heavy zebekiko. And you can hear his lesbian accent too now, the heavy L. Right? Almost unrecognizable. If it's the same composition, but it's infinitely more lesbian. It's infinitely more Anatolian Greek, not just in the style and the feel of the music, but it's like he's transported in his own body. His larynx, his vocal cords become Anatolian. Yeah, his accent is different. His diction is different. And his dad is there with them, right? So I just think this is such an eloquent and beautiful example of that. So just in conclusion, I think that there's so much more work to be done. There's so many avenues that we can explore in figuring out how to tell a more complete story of this very distinct, very particular group of people who are all over the Greek diaspora, who to this day, and I really mean to this day, are still working out this articulation of Anatolian Greekness that is very much predicated upon a conscious creative engagement with otherness, with the culture, the material culture, the art, the artistic culture of other Ottoman populations. We see this in all over Greece today. There's an explosion of interest in Turkish classical music, in all kinds of Balkan folk musics, but particularly in places like Lesvos and even in places like Lynn, Massachusetts. There's fourth generation Anatolian Greek Americans, whose great-grandparents were refugees, who are kids now who are really into this music. They might not speak a word of Greek, but you go to the church festival and you see them dancing this really heavy zebekika face to face. It's a really marvelous thing. So, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and your attention. If anybody has any questions or comments or at all, please, the floor will become yours in a minute. Ευχαριστώ. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Panayotis, for this amazing, it's very rich, it's very engaging lecture. So, as Panayotis said, he will welcome any questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come and give you the microphone. And as you are thinking about your questions, Panayotis, I was wondering if I could ask you, so you talked about this concept, or rather this mode of existing, the intercommunality. And I wanted to ask you, aside from the Anatolian Greeks in the diaspora, what happens to the Anatolian Greeks and this intercommunal ethos once Lesvos and the other areas are part of the Greek state? So what happens to their music or to their artistic production?
Yeah, well, in the case of Lesvos, and I did, when I was doing the research for this book, that's the cover of my book, by the way. I still don't believe that this actually is real, after having lived with this for 10 years. And I just love that. I love that photograph. And I'm sure you saw you all saw the poster, but that amazing poster who's the name of the artist from Vancouver? Chris, who's this guy who made the line drawing on the poster based on the two guys on the left. Yeah, on Lesvos, so I spent several months on Lesvos. I spent a lot of time actually with Nikki's first cousins, Stratis and Michalis. And this is a story that I tell in the book that I didn't go into at all in this talk. So thanks for asking that question. But it won't be 45 minutes long, this response. It's a really fascinating, parallel, but meandering story, because of course, these guys who arrived in Lynn, sure, there were tons of Anatolian Greeks and Armenians and to a lesser extent Turks there who wanted this music. But, outside of that parish and those coffee houses, it was a pretty niche thing, right? But on Lesvos, this was the pop music. These guys, the band, their family band, the Kyriakoglou family band, it was one of the most active ensembles on the island up until the mid-'80s, when electrified bouzouki pop music started to take over the panegyria and the festivals. Stratis, who I spent a lot of time with, again, Nikki's first cousin, told me incredible stories about, from the age of 6, when he played percussion in his dad's band, walking across the mountain and playing at, weddings that lasted 4 or 5 days. He said basically, like, we would, especially in the wintertime, we would work almost every night. All over the island. And he said, really up until the late 1970s, we had to play not just this vast repertoire of traditional Turkish and Anatolian village dance music, but he said we had to play tangos and polkas. And he said the evening would start, we'd play tangos, and then we'd play polkas, we'd play some mazurkas, some shadishes, and then we'd transition by playing some of our arrangements, again, just like Nikki did at home in his parlor. We'd play our arrangements of laika, of Greek popular songs, arranged for violin, saduri, brass instruments. And then when the good spirits really started boiling, then we would play zebekika, we'd play karsilamades, this kind of thing. So very parallel, just in the lesbian context, because of course there's a population of tens of thousands of people in that wider area who wanted this music. It was much more direct, and there was a much larger pool of musicians. So yeah.
Thank you, Panayotis. If you have questions, please raise your hand so that I can see you.
Thank you very much for this. Raise my hand first because I have kind of a related question.
Okay, awesome.
I think earlier you showed a picture going back to the 20s, and my question is about brass instruments specifically in a Greek island at that point in time.
Yeah.
Which to me was a bit unique, both from like the strong presence of it and also the variety. But I think I saw, there's a euphonium there.
Yeah.
Which is a bit unique for island music at that point.
Sure.
Just curious, where did brass influence in that island that early on? Is that coming from northern mainland Greece, Anatolian Greeks, like Turkish proper culture?
Yeah, that's a very important question. The historical record and oral tradition seem to suggest a combination of all those things, but in particular the fact that Mytilene, because of where it's Lesvos, because of where it's situated, right? It's obviously has close contact with the Anatolian coast, but also it's pretty close to these different places in northern Greece. However, there is not a brass tradition on any of these other islands. There's not a brass tradition on Chios, right, to the south there. There's not a brass tradition on, Samothraki or, Thasos or any of these places. The reason seems to be, just like places up here in northern Greece, is that Lesvos was always, in the Ottoman context, a very strategically important, politically important, and militarily important place. And there were huge Ottoman garrisons there, especially in the port. And from the early mid-19th century on, the period of reform in the late Ottoman Empire, there was a tremendous investment in Western-style everything, really, particularly in the arts and the military. And so we have a lot of evidence that there were brass military, Western military-style brass bands on Lesvos. And, one thing leads to another. Old instruments get discarded as new instruments are acquired, and people are pretty good at music, So people are pretty good at taking things and making them their own. So I think that's really the reason. But that mixed ensemble is very unique to Lesvos, right? And has been since the beginning of the 20th century.
Thanks.
And then we have, I'll since you're walking with the microphone, I'll try to keep track of hands as well.
Thank you. Fantastic talk. Thank you. And research. Amazing. I just want to, I'm curious how you connect or disconnect sort of the Western classical kind of Baroque tradition of ornamentation for varying and reinterpreting melody, and also the jazz tradition, which we think of kind of more South America, Africa, sort of like the kind of roots from there, like how the communication of music through those centuries, and how if this was something that was sort of original to that area that, affected other musics, or if it was affected by those musics, or both.
Right, okay. It's hard to say anything definitive in this particular case study or this realm of music. But the one thing we can say, and this cannot be overemphasized, we think of Western classical music, or Western European music that's been played by people in what we think of as Europe, and this Eastern music in the Balkans, Ottoman classical music, Greek folk music. They're cousins. I mean, they're not very far apart from each other. I mean, they're really closely related. They're very closely related. I mean, if you listen to, that's true of the self-consciously art music of both of those regions. If we can, we have to generalize or else we can't talk about anything, right? But it's also true of the folk music. I mean, if you listen to, Irish music, traditional Irish music, and you listen to, Irish fiddle, and you listen to fiddle playing, violin playing from, northwestern Turkey, or there are a lot of things that are similar, right? Not just that it's the same instrument, but the fact that it's the same instrument is very, very important. I think one of the things that's and also that the classical music traditions, I mean, classical European composers, from the classical era and from the Baroque era were very aware of Ottoman music. I mean, and Ottoman composers were very aware of Western music. I mean, there has been a constant stream of mutual communication and influence, sometimes indirect, sometimes very direct, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? I mean, and not just like Mozart, Rondo alla Turca, right? I mean, there's all many of them, but that's important, right? But so many other things. But I mean, the fact that the violin is a primary instrument in both of these traditions is tremendously important. So and this is one of I think the theoretical and methodological strengths of taking Ottoman philosophical ideas about music very seriously as tools, as analytical tools, is because the Ottoman tradition, very differently from the, especially, ethno-national, age of, European nationalism tradition, really is not very concerned with hard boundaries between, it's really not concerned with saying this is this because it's not that, which is definitely the European way of doing it. I'm English because I'm not German and I'm not French, right? Whereas the Ottoman attitude is something like, well, I'm from Izmir and I'm part of this local culture because, yeah, I'm from there, but also, I might be a Turkish-speaking Muslim, but I can't imagine that idea of myself without the Greeks, without the Armenians, without the whatever. So, I mean, that's the way I would answer that. I don't think there's really much communication traditionally with things like jazz. Sometimes we are tempted to compare the two because there's a lot of improvisation, playing solos in Greek and Turkish and whatever music. Now, and really for 100 years, there has been some influence of American music on these other traditions through the recording industry, but not much in the other direction. In fact, really none. That's important in a broad way.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. My question is, like you said, Rondo alla Turca, it was written 250 years ago.
Yeah.
You bought the score 250 years ago and you buy today exactly the same score. This music that, from what you said, you started describing periods in late 1800s till today. In the year 2022, I mean, 100 years ago, before recording instruments, somebody would copy, and then all they could do is listen to somebody else, and then copy, remember, interpret, create something personal.
Sure.
And the student will copy his teacher, and then you will go through many different teachers, you will hear the same thing but a little bit different. In the year 2022, today, do you see a kind of codification of the, say, 100, 200 prevailing songs, or you still see an evolution of these styles and development?
Right.
That's my question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a super important question. In a word, both. Absolutely. Because this tradition that's based on this idea, the meshk relationship, the teacher to pupil, the, learning orally through practice, through trial and error, eventually, gaining the approval of your peers and this kind of thing. I mean, that's all musicians do that. It's just that depending on your tradition, the tradition you're working in, you're encouraged to think about what you're doing in different ways, right? I mean, if you're a kid, classical violin player, piano player, you start when you're 5 and you have private lessons and you go to special high school and you go to Juilliard and blah, 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 and you're practicing 10 hours a day. You're still doing that, right? It's just, there's a culture of thinking about the primacy of the score and of intention, the intention of people who have explicitly written things out. And there's a different performance context and that kind of thing. But still, oral tradition is at work in those. A lot of people in my field in musicology have written really great things about that, interrogating that. But I think to the more directly to your question, there's a tremendous amount of codification of these different, traditional oral styles because, the recording industry, right? I mean, which has been doing this for 120 years. But also, even I've noticed in my lifetime, being someone who's really interested in, Greek folk, regional Greek folk music. When I was a teenager in the, in the the 90s, like the things that I was interested in. I mean, I was lucky to grow up in and around a community that had a lot of really great musicians, Greek musicians from this very particular tradition, the island of Kalymnos right here. And so I had the opportunity to learn a lot of repertoire and style just like really in my backyard, literally. And then when I started spending time in Greece as a young adult, sometimes, trying to learn more and trying to get better at things, it was, literally, sometimes my buddies and I who were interested in this stuff, like just to learn a new song, like a song that like we heard somebody sing but they couldn't remember it, like be like a 5-day excursion to like take a bus and go to some village and try to find somebody, doesn't have a phone and like, but they're with their sheep on the other side of the mountain, so why don't you just wait for a couple days? What do you mean wait for a couple days? Just wait for a couple days. What else is going on? There's nothing going on. Just wait for a couple days and help us like paint the house. That kind of thing. And then like the guy comes back and we learn not one new song from him, but 3. It's just like, oh my God. I feel very lucky to have had those. And I'm like right here in the microphone, I'm performing like authenticity, saying, oh, I learned it in the old-fashioned way. But it's true. But now, now everything is on YouTube. Everything has been recorded and everything has been put out on records, and everything is, in the world of, for example, competitive Greek folk dancing is a great case study of how it's very much a living tradition, and because living people are doing it, right? And they're learning from each other. And if you run a dance company, you can say, all right, well, this year I think we should do dances from this particular tiny village in like Western Macedonia. And it'd be great if we could go there, but we don't have to because just, there's 30 hours of footage that people have taken that we can study and we can, and you see this in, regional styles of folk music where like there are right versions of things. But often I've found, somebody who grew up in around this music from Kalymnos where, there's a few places in Greece, really, Crete for sure, Karpathos for sure, and to a lesser extent Kalymnos and a few other places, but very, very few. Kefalonia, my ancestral island, where improvised poetry, like in the moment, improvising, rhyming couplets, is still, in Cyprus for sure, it's still a living tradition. In the smaller places, it's dying out, but there's an architecture of how, like I call it in my nerdy academic way, like the language music interface. There's a particular way that every melody interacts with poetry, and if you don't understand how it works, you can make from the traditional perspective are extraordinarily egregious mistakes. That render what you're doing almost like just jarringly meaningless. And you see this a lot, you hear this a lot on recordings. There's an industry in Greece and all over the world of professional folk musicians, right? Who like play these, play concerts and make CDs and they do research. But sometimes the research is like finding a recording that somebody made and it's authentic because it's somebody from this place. But you might learn a version of a song that's like 2 songs mixed together and the poetry is wrong because the person couldn't remember, or maybe they weren't, they're not really well versed in it. And those becomes codified in like you make a record and somebody copies your record. So there's like 7 or 8 generations sometimes of like a song from Kalymnos that people not from Kalymnos, unfamiliar with the tradition, have recorded, and it's according to the rules wrong. It's great music, but like they've mixed 2 different verses together and it doesn't make sense. So that kind of thing, it's a fascinating, that was very convoluted, but hopefully you follow what I'm saying. But it's a fascinating dynamic. So yeah, both of those things are going on all the time, and it keeps people like me employed.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. A little bit of high level for us from music. If I grasp correctly the core of your talk, please correct me, is about this neighborly, if I got it correctly, or
Yeah.
mimesis in Greek.
Yeah, neighborliness or
Sadakat, is that?
yeah, sadaka, yeah,
And so that was a unifying
intercommunality,
thing.
yeah.
Since that's what transpired to the music, to this family that came to Boston. But then yet, when I look at the title of the echoes of the great catastrophe to any modern Greek, that was a big trap in the historical context. Is it because this particular musician avoided this theme, or actually he immigrated a few years before the 1922? Because it's surprising that somebody, even remotely, did not get affected, but something was a big historical event in the Greek history.
Sure. No, thank you very much for bringing that up. I decided not to really focus on that very explicitly, but I chose, yeah, Konstantinos didn't live through firsthand through that event, though his community certainly did, and he played music with and for a lot of people who did live through it. But I chose the word echoes very deliberately because a thread that runs through the book, because of the people I talked to, is that we love this music and all these other aspects of material and performative and creative culture that tie us to this past that we're so invested in, are really just the last thing that's tying us to it. And we're bathing ourselves in echoes, and we're doing everything that we can to keep those echoes echoing. But in the context we're living in, they're getting fainter and fainter as time goes on. And we do what we can to hold on to them. But there's pretty much everyone I spoke to for this project has a pretty, I think at best philosophical and at worst actively pessimistic and depressed attitude about their culture and their music. Because, unlike, people would say to me, they're like, yeah, we're both, like people my age, we're both fourth generation Greek Americans. And yeah, your village on Kefalonia was destroyed in an earthquake in 1953, but you can go there. You can go there and there's something there that we don't have. We can go to Ivali or whatever. We can go to, Kapi, the village in Mytilene where we're from, but it's not Kapi anymore. It's not Kapi, because Kapi was this place where for hundreds of years there were Greeks and Turks and Sephardic Jews, and that's our culture. There was like the Armenian butcher. There was my friend Dean has an uncle named, his first name is Francois, because his grandparents' best buddy who grew up next door was a French Levantine, French-speaking Levantine Christian guy. Those are like the echoes that they're trying to hold on to. These echoes of this world that are inevitably going to fade. And as Dean, I think, said to me, he's like, you know how it is where you hear an echo and you go, hey, 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 and you're like, oh, I want to do that again. Hey, 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 hey. You can do that. You can try to imitate that thing. You can, as best you can, but you can't hold on to it. It's always gonna leave. So, and not to make light of not to compare, in a flippant way, that sense of loss with, the egregious, horrible loss of so many lives and the destruction of the context of so many millions of lives 100 years ago. But pretty much everyone who I interviewed and spent time with for this project very explicitly talked about this in that way. So.
Thank you, Panayotis. We have time for one final question, and then we will have our intermission before we have the music performance.
A short question. Thank you. Are there any recordings of an ensemble like that?
Yeah, a lot. Today, I'm sorry?
I haven't heard such music. It would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, well, there's there's something of a revival of this style of music happening on Lesvos right now. But I would say the most interesting is there was a double record, which you can buy it as a 2 CD set, that was put together in the 90s by Nikos Dionysopoulos, who's a Greek researcher. It's called Lesvos Eolis. And I think the English, it's a beautiful, it's 2 CDs. It's field recordings that they made in some of them go back to the 70s, some of them are the early, or maybe I'm wrong. I think maybe it was all in the early 90s or something like that. But it's a really valuable kind of collection of snapshots in time of musical traditions from all over the island. And there's a gorgeous big 100-page booklet. It's bilingual too, so half of it's Greek, half of it's in English with biographies of all the musicians. And actually, Konstantinos' brother Michalis, who's there with the trombone, his grandchildren Stratis, his son Menelaos, and his grandchildren Stratis and Michalis, who I spent time with, their family band is on a couple of the tracks, and so you can really hear that sound. It's quite wonderful. It's a very different thing. It blew my head off when I heard it. I bought it when I was in my early 20s living in Athens, and I found it in a record store, and I bought it because it had a cool picture of it might actually, I think actually that's where I got these 2 pictures from. But it had a cool picture on the front of, actually I think that picture on the left is maybe the album cover. And I was like, what? Violin and cornet and saduri together? And, but talking about the legacy of Ottoman intercommunality, that record has recordings of people playing, arias from Armenian operas from the early 20th century, that have entered the folk repertoire of Lesvos. So Lesvos is a great case study. The case study of Lesvos really challenges in a direct way a lot of the hard, fast ideas that we have, about the binaries between folk music and music that's not folk music, that apparently folks don't play or whatever. So I highly recommend Lesvos Eolis. I think in English Lesvos and then Aiolis, Aeolian Lesvos. So.
Thank you, Panayotis. Thank you for this wonderful first part. We will refrain from the round of applause right now because I'm sure many will follow later. So we will have a 5-minute break. You can stretch your legs, grab some water, and we'll be back in 5 minutes to hear Panayotis' performance.
Καλώς ήρθατε. Και πάλι. Καλώς δεν φύγατε. Well, thank you so very much. Now we move on to the more explicitly musical part of our time together here. So as Simos said in his very generous introduction, I'm going to play a mix of some traditional music from the island of Kalimnos, which is a tradition that I grew up around, and some songs that are explicitly about the various Greek American experiences, and then perhaps a few of my own musical settings of the poetry of Konstantin Cavafi, who's one of my favorites of all time. So as is fitting, I'm a Florida man. I grew up in and around the town of Tarpon Springs, Florida, which is a little bit north of Tampa. Tarpon Springs is a delightfully strange place. It's the only place in America, and probably the only place in the world, I don't know the proportion in Darwin, Australia, of Greeks to non-Greeks, but Tarpon Springs definitely has the highest percentage of Greek people anywhere outside of the political borders of Greece today, and has had that distinction since 1907 or so, when a whole bunch of Greek sponge divers from the islands of Hydra and Spetses showed up there pretty soon. They were followed by several thousand men from the island of Kalimnos, which had a monopoly on the sponge trade in the Mediterranean for centuries. And today, Tarpon, even though numerically it's not majority Greek, it's really run by Greeks, and particularly people from the islands of Kalymnos and Simi, and to a lesser extent Chalki. So I grew up, even though, like I said, my family is from the island of Kefalonia, I grew up with Kalymnian culture as mainstream Greek culture. I was very fortunate to spend a lot of time as a young man with a lot of really, really, really extraordinarily talented singers, and to a lesser extent, instrumentalists, particularly people playing the tsabuna, which is the goatskin bagpipe, which I didn't bring with me, but next time I'll bring it. So, as is fitting, I'm going to start with a song from Kalymnos, which is called, we call it Yawa, or Kotikos Skopos, tune from the island of Kos. And it's traditionally what's sung and danced at the beginning of any festive gathering. And so usually we sing a mandinada, or a rhyming couplet of welcome. So something's going to pop into my head and I'm going to sing it. So if you feel like dancing in Isos, dance, feel free. You can do a sirtos to it too. It's not a sirtos, but nobody's watching. So I sang, I think, two traditional mandinades, or couplets. The first one says, «Χίλια καλώς ευρέθημε και πάλι να βρεθούμε, του χρόνου τούτο τον καιρό να ξανανταμωθούμε». So it's a thousand times a blessing that we came together, and I hope, and may we come together again. Hopefully this time next year we'll all be together in good health. And then the second one says, tonight our parea, all of us, our group of people who are together, we're a parea now for life. Απόψε η παρέα μας ξύζει χιλιάδες άσπρα, τον γκάμπο με τα λούλουδα, τον ουρανό με τ' άστρα. So tonight our group, our parea, deserves 1,000 silver coins, 1,000 silver pieces. The field with all of its flowers, and the sky with all of its stars. So it's a beautiful romantic musical tradition. So I'll do another tune from Kalymnos. This one is very explicitly associated with sponge divers and sponging culture. Sponge diving is an extremely dangerous profession. In fact, When I was a kid in Tarpon, there's this curio shop called Spongerama that had this terrifying diorama exhibit in the back room that had all these, like mannequins behind glass, depicting various sponge-related things, like people, building and caulking the sponge boat, the ladies like weaving funeral shrouds for the guys who aren't going to come home, divers preparing kavurmas, which is a kind of like a preserved meat dish, et cetera, et cetera. And the final one, like you'd go in, you pay like 50 cents or whatever, and you'd walk in and you look at all the dioramas, and you get to the end, and it was called The Death of the Sponge Diver. And it had this, it depicted there's a diver like lying in the boat, and his skin is gray, and like blood is coming out of his nose, and he's got his helmet off, and he's died of the bends, of decompression sickness. And I just remember seeing that like over and over when I was a kid. And there was a little plaque at the bottom that said, sponge diving, the America's most dangerous profession, according to National Geographic 1953 or something, which is true. I found that issue of National Geographic, like a commemorative reissue of it in Greece, actually, at an internet cafe. And I stole it, and it's in my house. I'm sure they didn't mind. Clearly nobody had ever read it because it was in pristine condition. But yeah, it's wild. So this is a song that if you're interested in Greek traditional music, or if you've been around it, you almost certainly know this song. It's called Falasaki. That's what we call it. And it's associated with Kalimnos because the typical lyrics that are sung to it, and I'll sing the most common mandinava that is sung to it. It goes, Θάλασσα τους θαλασσινούς, μην τους θαλασσοδέρνεις, ροδόσταμο να γίνεσαι, την πόρκατος να ρένεις. Which means sea, so it's addressing the ocean as an animate force, that can be reasoned with, right? In vain. Sea, please don't. It's a great word, thalassodherno, to like beat with one's sea-ness or something, like beat with the waves. Please don't beat them with your waves. Just rather become rosewater and sprinkle yourself on their borka, which is a Kalimnian word that means like this piece of hair right here, like the Superman curl, the forelock, I guess. So I'll sing that, Falasaki. Kalimnian music is very shouty. This is the loudest it's going to get in this, until maybe the very end. just going to adjust this microphone a little bit. Hold on. Can you hear everything? The balance is okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Opa. So like I said, I spent a great deal of my childhood in Tarpon Springs, Florida, and as we were discussing earlier, there was this remarkable musician. It's pretty, I try not to use the word amazing unless I really mean that something makes me like, whoa, amazes me. This amazing, amazing preacher, this man named Yorgos Theologitis, but his nickname was Katsaros, the curly-haired one. He was one of the foundationally important people in the story of Greek music Greek music period in the 20th century, but particularly in America. He was born on the island of Nisiros in, let's do the math, 1880 something. Plaka. He might have been born in that same year that Kyriakoglou was born. He might have been born in 1888. We can Google it later. But he came to Los Angeles, actually, as a young man. He worked in Hollywood. He had parts in a couple of silent movies. I can't remember which ones. He made some of the very earliest recordings of Greek music in the United States, of what we now refer to as rebetika. And this is a song. He lived the last 50 years or so of his life in Tarpon Springs, and he was buddies with my papu, with my grandfather, and they had the two of them and Archbishop Iakovos, who would always come to Tarpon for Epiphany, were buddies, and so the three of them would often hang out at my yaya and papu's house in Tarpon, and Iakovos would cut grapefruit from our tree, and they'd have that as a meze with their coffee or their ouzo or whatever. So Katsaros, I didn't ever hang out with him or anything when I was young. Unfortunately, I didn't really get a first-hand experience of learning music from him, but I have a lot of friends who did. And I don't really have any first-hand Katsaros stories, except for that we all called him two-tone because he had this great head of very curly hair. He always wore a hairnet. And at some point in his 80s, I think he had a stroke. And when he was recovering after the stroke, his hair, which was all white, half of it came back in black. Like not quite Bride of Frankenstein style, but pretty close. And so we all called him two-tone. But he was an amazing figure, and had a very unique guitar style, where he played the bass strings with his thumb and played melody with his fingers. Can you all hear the guitar? Okay. Okay, cool. So, hold on. This is a song that I don't think Katsaros ever recorded. The most well-known recording of it was by Charilaos Piperakis, who was a Cretan lira player from the Chania region, like Valerie, right? Is that her name we talked about earlier? Yeah. But Katsaros sang this song a lot with his own words. He probably learned it from Piperakis. Katsaros was a great storyteller and made a lot of dubious claims. He claimed to have had affairs with like Greta Garbo and people like that. He claimed to be buddies with Paganini, and this kind of thing. Segovias, the great guitarist Segovia. He used to say things like, I showed Segovia some licks. But this is a song that, according to some of my friends, he played a lot. It's called, a lot of these songs aren't called anything really. Nobody knows really who wrote this, but it was recorded under the title To West, The West, by Charilaos Piperakis sometime in the 1930s or maybe early 40s. And the lyrics go, Sacramento και Lodai, O Theos na sas philai. Sacramento and Lodi, may God protect you. Στο Σολέκι και στο Beauty, in Salt Lake City and in Butte, Montana. Mutiskasan sto barbuti. They cheated me at cards and such. It also mentions sto modesto, sto valejo, ticho pathi desto leo. I won't even tell you what I've suffered in Modesto and Lodi. But also talks about frisco. And it was recorded by Marco Melkon, the great Armenian, Smyrna-born Armenian oud player and singer, where he added some verses about Boston, where he lived. And so Katsaros probably invented his own, but I'll just give you a taste of this song. It's called The West. Yeah. And there is also a verse that Piperakis mentions. He says, "Que sto south is fungarades, hasane polus parades." And in the south, the sponge divers lost lots of money. Sacramento que lo dai, Sacramento que lo dai, Sacramento que lo dai, ο Θεός να σας φυλάει. Στο Σαλέκι και στο Beauty, στο Σολέκι και στο Beauty, στο Σολέκι και στο Beauty, που τη σκάσαν στο μπαρμπούτι. San Francisco, πήγα και στο San Francisco, πήγα και στο San Francisco, όλο χασίκλιδες βρίσκω. Πήγα για να πάρω τσένζι, πήγα για να πάρω τσένζι, πήγα για να πάρω τσένζι και φύγαμε δίχως έντσι.
December 1888.
What did I tell you? Amazing. Wow, incredible. Now I got to look up and see what Konstantinos' birthday was.
And he died in 1997.
That's right. Yep, he was 109 years old. Yep. When Katsaros turned 100, they gave him the keys to the city and they took away his driver's license. Nere. So, as someone who is of mixed Greek and Irish descent and grew up around a lot of traditional Irish music, much of which was about the Irish immigrant experience, I've always found it a travesty that there are not more songs in an Irish style in the English language about Greek sponge divers. So, βάζω το λιθαράκι το δικό μου. I make my own small contribution, and this is a song, I'll play you a song that I wrote, actually. Let's see if this is the right. So I didn't grow up diving for sponges or anything, although my best friend in Tarpon is a full-time sponge diver. But I did, my family were sponge merchants, and then my great-grandfather had a sponge, packing house, and he had a sponging supply store, so where captains and divers would go to buy everything from air hoses to tools to diesel for the engine that keeps the air pumping for the diver. So even though I've never had that experience of being down on the bottom, I've spent a lot of time with a lot of people who have, and so this is a song that I put together based on conversations I've had with divers, both in Kalymnos but primarily in Tarpon Springs, and just being, I suppose, a student and lover of that very strange place that has become a little piece of Kalymnos, and to a lesser extent other islands here in the New World. So it's called Golden Harvest, which unintentionally, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Tina Bukouvalas, who got her PhD in folklore from UCLA in the early 1980s, I want to say, maybe slightly later. Really extraordinary folklore specializing in Greek, American, and particularly Tarpon Springs' sponge industry. She's working on a book. I wrote this song, and then she told me, I have a contract for this book that I've been working on forever. It's called Golden Harvest. And I was like, oh. So I probably stole it from Tina, but I'm sure she wouldn't mind. Salty scrub, Spanish moss, and palmetto. Silver tarpon dancing in the speckled light above. At my waist, an old net and stiletto. Golden harvest, you'll be the death of me. The current, palms of porcelain, feet of lead, eels and manatees for my companions. Cyan-dappled silence draped across the virgin beds in these forests of Corval and canyons. The sun is burning, not a drop across our lips, only smoke and the diesel we're breathing. Laughter in the moonlight, songs of home and painted ships, shepherds, kings, and the women we're of me. I hear my mother's heartbeat in the hum of the machine. See my daughter's fond smile in its workings. Breath and body hanging from the hands that hold the line, while my fate in the darkness is lurking. Bales of golden bounty bound for auction on the shore. Grass and wool clipped and sheared soft as cotton. Weary windburned faces, leather brown by salt and sun. Tangled weeds like the beads on the bottom. Golden harvest, you'll be the death of me. Golden harvest, you'll be the death of me. Thank you. Okay? No. Just do a couple of more here. I promised you some kavafi, so some kavafi you will get. Just tune the lauto. Lauto players, we often say, we spend half our time tuning and the other half of our time playing out of tune. So this is one of my favorite poems by Constantine Cavafy. It's called Fornes Voices. It's been set to music who knows how many times, but almost always is the case with these big poets, Seferis, Cavafis, Elitis, these guys. Usually the music that their poetry is set to belongs to that realm of high culture, music meant to be on a stage, with a string quartet and a chorus and very sophisticated kind of Western classical music inspired stuff. And in the poetry of all these people, especially Seferis and Cavafis, and certainly Elitis and Gatsos too, I hear very loudly the echoes of Greek folk traditions. And so I have a project that I'm working on, taking some of their well-known poetry, but also some obscure stuff, and setting it to music that's informed by the more folk traditions of the Aegean. So this is one of those. It's a poem by Cavafis called Fornes. I'll read you the Edmund Keeley and Philip Sherrard translation. So in their translation, it's called Voices. Voices, loved and idealized, of those who have died, or of those lost for us like the dead. Sometimes they speak to us in dreams. Sometimes, deep in thought, the mind hears them. And with their sound, for a moment, return sounds from our life's first poetry, like music at night, distant, fading away. και αγαπημένες εκείνων που πεθάναν και εκείνων που είναι για μας χαμένοι σαν τους πεθαμένους. Κάποτε μες στα όνειρά μας ομιλούνε, κάποτε μες στη σκέψη τες ακούει το λαό. Κάποτε μες στα όνειρά μας ομιλούνε, κάποτε μες στη σκέψη μας ακούει το μυαλό. Και με τον ήχο των για μια στιγμή επιστρέφουν ήχοι από την πρώτη πτήση της ζωής μας, σαν μουσική τη νύχτα μακρινή που σβήνει. Ιδανικές φωνές και αγαπημένες εκείνων που πεθάναν και εκείνων που είναι για μας χαμένοι σαν τους πεθαμένους. Κάποτε μες στα όνειρά μας ομιλούνε, κάποτε μες στη σκέψη τους ακούει το λαό. Κάποτε μες στα όνειρά μας ομιλούνε, κάποτε μες στη σκέψη ακούει το μυαλό. Και με τον ήχο των για μια στιγμή επιστρέφουν ήχοι από την πρώτη πτήση της ζωής μας, σαν μουσική τη νύχτα μακρινή που σβήνει. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. I'll do one more for you and then we'll move next door, right? So normally when you're planning concerts, planning a program, you want to end on a real energetic number. And I believe in that, but I also believe that energy is not always fast. So here's one of my favorite songs that I learned as a Kalimnian song, but I learned later that it's actually a Cypriot song. I'm going to dedicate this to my friend Simo, who moved, maybe not heaven and earth, but did something close to that to bring me out here. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for everything that you've done and everything that you're doing, and the same to Sharon and everyone here. But this is a traditional Cypriot, as we would say, epitrapezio, called to Yasemi. To Yasemi sti porta su, and it's got these wonderful romantic lyrics. To Yasemi sti porta su, ήρθα να το κλαδέψω, και νόμισεν η μάνα σου πως ήρθα να σε κλέψω. I came to cut the jasmine at your door, and your mother thought I came to steal you away. So I'll sing one or two verses of this. This is the Kalimnian version, so the Cypriots in the audience will recognize it, but you'll also notice that it has a Kalimnian accent in the music. So, ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και καλή μας συνέχεια. Yeah. μάνα σου για σεμίνου. Και νομισένει μάνα σου για σεμίνου. Πώς ήρθα να σε κλέψω, Άγια βρήμου. Βαχή, πώς ήρθα να σε κλέψω, Άγια βρήμου. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Panayotis, thank you for the generosity with which you share your scholarship, your talent. I'm sure everybody is feeling very grateful. So join me in the proper round of applause for everything that Panayotis has offered us today.